What would you do if someone was keeping your grandchildren away from you? Most people would call a lawyer, maybe fight it in court. But 75-year-old grandmother Donna Adelson, she called a hitman. And just days ago, a jury found her guilty of orchestrating one of the most shocking murder-for-hire plots in recent memory. This is the story of how a bitter custody battle turned a grandmother into a killer, and how twisted logic can transform what we think of as love into something deadly. On July 18, 2014, Dan Markel was coming home from the gym in Tallahassee, Florida. The 41-year-old law professor at Florida State University pulled into his garage like any other day. But this wasn't any other day. Two men had been following him in a rented Toyota Prius. As Dan sat in his car, one of them walked up and shot him in the head. Dan died at the hospital hours later, leaving behind two young boys who would never see their father again. For anyone looking at this case from the outside, Don seemed like an unlikely target for murder. He was a respected legal scholar, a devoted father, and by all accounts, a good man. But to the Adelson family, Dan Markel represented something else entirely. He was the obstacle standing between them and what they wanted most, unlimited access to his children. The trouble started years earlier, when Don married Wendy Adelson in 2006. Wendy came from money. Her family owned a successful dental practice in South Florida, and they were used to getting what they wanted. But Dan had his own successful career as a law professor in Tallahassee, and that's where he planned to stay. When Dan and Wendy divorced in 2012, the real problems began. Dan had custody of their two sons, and Florida law meant Wendy couldn't just pack up and move back to South Florida to be closer to her family. She needed Dan's permission to relocate the children, and Dan said no. This is where Donna Adelson enters our story. Donna wasn't just any grandmother. She was the matriarch of a wealthy family, who was used to solving problems with money and control. When Dawn refused to let Wendy move the children closer to the family, Donna saw it as a personal attack. In her mind, Dan was keeping her grandchildren away from her, and that was unforgivable. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Donna didn't just want Dan out of the picture, she wanted him dead. What happened next shows just how far a person can go when they convince themselves that their actions are justified. Instead of accepting the court's decision or finding legal ways to spend more time with her grandchildren, Donna began plotting Dan's murder. She recruited her son Charlie, a dentist, to help arrange the killing. Charlie became the middleman in a plot that would eventually involve multiple killers, go-betweens, and a web of payments designed to cover their tracks. The key connection was Catherine Magbanua, a woman who was dating Charlie Adelson. Catherine had connections to the criminal world through her ex-boyfriend Sigfredo Garcia. Garcia and his friend Luis Rivera were career criminals who were willing to commit murder for the right price. What the Adelsons didn't realize was that, by bringing these people into their world, they were creating a paper trail that would eventually destroy them all. The planning was elaborate and took months to execute. Garcia and Rivera drove from Miami to Tallahassee in a rented car, staying in motels for 2 nights before the murder. They studied Dan's routine, learning his schedule and figuring out the best place to strike. They knew, when he went to the gym, what route he took home, and exactly when he would be most vulnerable. On that July morning, in 2014, they waited for him to return from his workout and executed their plan in broad daylight. The entire operation cost the Adelson family around $100,000. With the money flowing through Charlie to Catherine to the killers themselves. But here's what makes this case so chilling. Donna Adelson genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. In her twisted logic, Dan was the villain in this story. He was keeping her family apart, and eliminating him would solve all their problems. Wendy could move back to South Florida, the grandchildren would be closer, and life could go back to the way Donna wanted it to be. Of course, that's not how it worked out. The investigation into Dan's murder was thorough and relentless. Police traced the rental car, followed the money trail, and slowly built a case against everyone involved. Garcia and Rivera were convicted first, followed by Catherine Magbanua, who prosecutors said helped connect the killers to the Adelson family. Then came Charlie Adelson, Donna's son, who was convicted in November 2023. If you're as shocked by this family's choices as I am, hit that subscribe button because we're diving deep into cases that'll leave you questioning everything you think you know about family loyalty. The conviction of Charlie was the beginning of the end for Donna. Just days after her son was found guilty, Donna and her husband Harvey did something that showed they knew exactly how guilty they were. They rushed to get visas and booked one-way tickets to Vietnam, a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. They were literally trying to flee the country to avoid prosecution. But investigators were watching. On November 13, 2023, as Donna and Harvey tried to board their flight to Vietnam at Miami International Airport, police were waiting. Donna was arrested right there on the jetway, her escape plan falling apart in the most dramatic way possible. The 75-year-old grandmother who thought she could outsmart the justice system was led away in handcuffs. Her one-way ticket to freedom, becoming evidence of her guilt. The trial that followed was a masterclass in how the justice system works when investigators do their job right. Prosecutors laid out a clear timeline of the murder plot, showing how Donna was the driving force behind everything that happened. They presented evidence of payments, communications, and the family's desperate attempts to cover their tracks. The defense tried to argue that Donna was just a grandmother who loved her family, but the evidence was overwhelming. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when Donna's own son testified against her. Robert Adelson, a doctor in New York who had distanced himself from his family after the murder, took the stand and described how his mother had talked about the murder plot. His testimony showed that this wasn't a family united in grief, but a family torn apart by one person's deadly obsession. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who used her wealth and influence to orchestrate murder, all while hiding behind the facade of being a loving grandmother. They showed how Donna funded the killing, helped plan the cover-up, and then tried to flee the country when the walls started closing in. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. This was calculated, premeditated murder driven by a woman who couldn't accept that she couldn't control everything in her family's life. When the jury returned their verdict on September 4, 2024, after just 3 hours of deliberation, Donna's reaction said everything. She gasped and began sobbing as the judge read the 3 verdicts: guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of conspiracy, and guilty of solicitation. "Oh my God," she said audibly, as if she couldn't believe that her actions had finally caught up with her. The woman who had spent years thinking she was above the law, who believed her money and family connections would protect her, was now facing the reality of life in prison. At 75 years old, Donna Adelson will likely spend the rest of her life behind bars for a crime that accomplished nothing except destroying more lives. But the most tragic part of this story isn't what happened to Donna, or even what happened to Dan, as terrible as that was. The real tragedy is what happened to the children at the center of this whole mess. Dan and Wendy's 2 sons lost their father to a violent murder orchestrated by their own grandmother. These children, who should have been surrounded by love and protection, instead became the unwitting victims of their family's twisted logic. Think about that for a moment. Donna claimed she orchestrated this murder because she loved her grandchildren and wanted them closer. But her actions ensured that these boys would grow up knowing their father was killed by their own family. How do you explain that to a child? How do you help them understand that the grandmother who claimed to love them was responsible for the most traumatic event of their young lives? This case forces us to confront some uncomfortable questions about family loyalty and how far people will go in the name of love. Donna Adelson didn't see herself as a monster. In her mind, she was a devoted mother and grandmother who was protecting her family. She had convinced herself that Dan was the enemy, and that eliminating him was not just justified, but necessary. This kind of thinking is more common than we'd like to admit. How many family disputes escalate because one person decides they know what's best for everyone else? How often do we see people justify terrible actions because they believe their cause is righteous? Donna's case is an extreme example, but the underlying psychology, the ability to rationalize harmful behavior, when we convince ourselves we're the good guys, is something we all need to be aware of. The Dan Markel murder case also highlights the importance of the legal system in protecting people from those who would abuse their power. Dan tried to follow the law, work within the system, and protect his rights as a father. The Adelsons decided they were above all that. They thought their money and connections made them untouchable, and that they could solve their problems through violence and intimidation. But in the end, justice prevailed. It took over a decade, but everyone involved in Dan's murder has now been held accountable. The 2 triggermen, the go-between, the son who helped arrange it all, and finally, the grandmother who started it all. They're all in prison, where they belong. Donna Adelson will be sentenced soon, and she's facing mandatory life in prison for the first-degree murder conviction. At 75 years old, this is effectively a death sentence. The woman who thought she could buy her way out of any problem will spend her final years in a prison cell. A cautionary tale about what happens when twisted logic meets unlimited resources and a complete disregard for human life. As we wrap up this case, it's worth remembering that Don Markel was more than just a victim in a sensational crime story. He was a father, a teacher, a scholar, and by all accounts, a decent man who was trying to do right by his children. His murder didn't solve any of the Adelson family's problems, it only created new ones. While destroying the lives of two innocent children who lost their father to their family's greed and obsession. The next time you hear someone justify harmful actions because they claim to be protecting their family, remember Donna Adelson. Remember how quickly love can turn into something deadly when we convince ourselves that our desires matter more than other people's rights, and that the ends always justify the means. If this case has left you thinking about the psychology behind family crimes and the justice system, don't miss our upcoming episodes where we dive deep into the minds of people who commit the unthinkable. And let me know in the comments, have you ever seen family loyalty taken too far in your own life? How do we protect ourselves and our loved ones from the kind of twisted thinking that turned a grandmother into a killer? Until next time, this is Accused, reminding you that the truth is often stranger and more disturbing than fiction.